Thank you, Paul. It's as Wang was suggesting, it's a really rich and provocative paper, also giving quite radical rethinking about hope. And because of the radical rethinking, it's a necessarily dense paper. So my comments then would be mainly about how I understand the argument and how I might contextualize it. So I would probably begin something like this, that ecology can be understood really as a history of the future. Climate change, which is how the question of ecology comes to the surface in the paper. Climate change raises questions, firstly, about how we think about the future, and therefore, secondly, raises the question of hope for the future, and thirdly, most interestingly, the different forms of hope, or what Paul calls the ambiguous value of hope. So what we see here in the paper is actually three kinds of hope, or we could even say three politics of hope. And this is, I think, what he calls the ambiguous value of hope. Now, I think that also these, we might just briefly tabulate the three kinds of hope as follows, right? One, in relationship to climate change, ecology and climate change. Now, the first position might be something like this. It would be the position of climate change deniers, right? And the deniers hope against all evidence that climate change is in fact not happening. And when they do that, they are able to return to business as usual and maintain the position that no change is necessary. So, in other words, the quote unquote exploitation can go on as usual. Now, what this already suggests is that ecology is not just green, right? It is also, it is gray, as Paul Virilio reminds us, because ecology would include not just pollution of the physical environment, but also the pollution of technology and the pollution of politics. Or Felix Guattari in the three ecologies would say that ecology involved environmental, social, and political factors. So it's everything, actually. So with climate change deniers, what we find is that is the hope that all is well. And this hope that all is well is therefore merely self-serving, right? So that's one of the gradations of hope. Now, the second one, of course, is much more ethical, you might say, is the sustainability arguments. And these arguments looks at the growing evidence about climate change and hopes that the situation is serious, but not fatal. We can still try to stop, delay, or mitigate the disaster through policy changes, finding new sources of energy, reducing the use of non-renewable resources like fossil fuels, and so on and so forth. The third position, deep adaptation theory, which is what Paul spends most of the paper elaborating on, is also the most paradoxical. Its position is that it is already too late, and catastrophe is certain, imminent, and therefore cannot be mitigated. Hence, it is often critical of sustainability arguments. Its diagnosis, you might say, compared to sustainability arguments, which believes that the situation is serious but not fatal. The argument of deep adaptation theory might be described as this, that the situation is fatal but not serious. Not serious in the sense that serious mitigation efforts are futile because the bus has already left the station. To believe that we can return to or restore a previous situation is just wishful utopianism or nostalgia. And this is because sustainability efforts still relies on the kinds of knowledge and thinking that got us into this mess in the first place. This is the deep adaptation theory critique, if you like, of sustainability theory. It is what, for example, Adorno and Horkheimer, in an indispensable text, analyzes the dialectic of enlightenment, right? The way in which they can trace a direct line from enlightenment to Auschwitz. You know, the critique of instrumental reason and so on and so forth. Or another way of thinking about it, of dialectic of enlightenment, is to call it the Chinatown syndrome. You remember in Polanski's film, Chinatown. Chinatown is a place where the more you try to help, the more harm you do, right? So it's like a kind of vicious circle. So that's one of the points of its critique. Now, so the question for deep adaptation theory, which is what I think most of Paul's paper focuses on, is what kind of thinking helps us write or imagine the disaster, right? Well, what can we do now to confront the disaster, like before, what you call, before the crisis, not in terms of antecedent to it, right? But confronting, confronting. And here I'll just pick up a few points because it's a very rich paper and there's a lot of other things going on as well. But let me just pick up what I believe are a few key points. The first move is to, according to Paul, is to leave the library of knowledge or to leave the memory palace. In other, to leave the Enlightenment tradition, our conventional views of knowledge. And here he mentions, as it were, two writers, Taleb and Echo. And I think here you see also how the argument moves towards unconventional ways of thinking knowledge, politics, and so on and so on. So Taleb, as he points out, the book, The Black Swan, is a kind of critique of rational choice theory, but it critiques that by confronting rational choice theory with the notion of volatility, right? Like volatility in capital markets. And the thing about volatility in capital markets is that they are non-directional, right? You don't know exactly what direction it's going to go in, right? Like all the statistics that you have of the past would not allow you or qualify you to predict what is going to happen in the future. So in this sense, it's also a kind of an intervention into, shall we say, theories of history. Echo, as we know, is a novelist and a critic. And one of the things that he, as well, advocates here is what he calls moving towards the position of being an anti-scholar and anti-library, which is the other side of what the lead is talking about, which is as it were the unknown, right? Not as it were knowledge as what has been established, but towards a kind of unknown knowledge. And this, of course, links up in physics, for example, with the notion of, let's say, dark matter and dark energy, as we know, right? Like the known universe, matter, the known universe made up of 4%, right, of known matter, right? The rest of the 96% made up of the stuff that you can only call dark matter or dark energy. And dark simply is the word here, meaning unknown. So from this point of view, then history, it's not just a projection, right? And or you might even put it, you know, maybe even provocatively as follows, that all we learn from history is that we learn nothing, definitely, from history. Or as the 9th century poet Mallarmé said, a throw of the dice never will abolish chance. And of course, you see, this is also related to this notion that Echo and others call belatedness, right? Or late styles, right? And something that, of course, Borges has very, I have a quotation here actually, that Borges is defined as follows. Let me just quickly read this out. I would define the Baroque as that style that deliberately exhausts or tries to exhaust its own possibilities, that borders on self-caricature. The Baroque is the final stage in all art, right? Late art, when art flaunts and squanders its own resources, right? The library of knowledge as well. When you leave the library of knowledge, that is the moment of late style, or what Borges calls the Baroque. So then from here, I think we can quickly jump to this point. I'm taking too much time, of radical hope, right? And radical hope, not as either knowledge or ignorance, which is denial. Knowledge would be, you know, all these scientific attempts to mitigate the situation. So radical hope can be found not either in knowledge or in ignorance, in denial, but in what we might call fascination. Fascination, not as a kind of mystification, but fascination as a relationship to what we do not know, right? So it's not a knowledge nor ignorance, but a relationship to what we do not know. And this, of course, is in a sense, Jonathan Lear's reading of it, and his story about Manikou and the kinds of courage that is involved in taking on an orthodox position. So just a few more quick points. And this then, I think, towards the end, Paul refers to a topic that I'm sure he deals with in much greater detail in his book, Love's Shadow, which is the notion of transport, right? It's not that he doesn't, I think, spend too much time explaining that. But I would understand transport here in the sense of love as transport, as emotion, as ecstasy. So transport, therefore, as a kind of leap, right? A transport, a leap, towards the unknown, right? The way in which you might think about metaphor, right? Metaphor as also a kind of transport. And the second thing he says about love is, of course, this notion of love's shadow. And the shadow here would be the unknown part right, of love. Not love just in a sentimental sense, but the large element of the risk, the risk of encountering the unknown. So, for example, we might therefore say that his paper could also be entitled Hope's Shadow, right? Not just Love Shadow, but Hope's Shadow. So there are a few more points that I should stop here. Okay.
Thank you for these very deep thinking on these issues. I have some questions and comments for these. First of all, I really appreciate your deep reflection on the basis of the whole idea of sustainability, and give us your deep suspicion of those like the institutional bureaucratic the projects for these, which already was really inside of the logic of developmentalism. So that gave us a rethink about the hope. These sides, I think I really appreciate it. And my question here, I want you to clarify. One is that when you talk about the criticize utopian idea, and I remember that especially the Ernst Bloch, his idea of utopia and hope. And in his early writing, he tried to make some distinction between sort of two kinds of the not yet conscious and not yet becoming. So my understanding is that you suggest us that we are already in the catastrophe, in the process of that catastrophe. It means that everything, it's a supposed, this is almost like not only Aristotle, but also even the Confucius. He saw that he started his thinking from the position when the whole order, the ritual order completely collapsed. For him, this is a catastrophe. All the things were rethink about these. So it's already here. So that's a starting point. But on the other hand, not yet conscious for me, it's not completely different from your idea about the knowledge, unknowing. So in that sense, what you try to do, I think it's a different from unconscious. It always means that someday we were conscious of it, as something becoming. When you say that it's like the David Hume's idea was unknown as a permanent hypothesis, but always with something in the shadows there. So these are the idea. What I'm in the reality. So these kind of the reflection on the planning, for example, there was a long tradition. For example, from that direction, like David Hume, and also we found that from another side, like the Fred Hayek, is also trying to use that idea to criticize all kinds of the planning. So that's the projects. His idea is also somehow, politically I disagree with him, but also deserves us to think about his idea. But that idea can be misused or abused by new liberals. So the later. So this is another. I try to. Though I agree with your starting point, but something unconscious, right? We don't know what will happen following that logic. That people will use that idea. So it's also the still, if we only have these kind of philosophical starting, the thinking reflection, we still difficult to avoid the misuse of these concepts. And that's what I can compare those epistemological issues. I think they still try to do these. And also, we can think about some other scholars' idea. Like for example, Carl Polanyi. His argument is that the market itself is the result of planning. And the planning itself could be the spontaneous because it's a reaction to the catastrophe or that market crisis. So in that sense, how can we different types of the planning? I mean, this planning, maybe it's not something, one thing, but different things. It's how can you start from this, have more reflection on these. So these are the second comment. Last one, maybe I can think about in Chinese cases, the context. Some people, some ideas, I think that, for example, the Chinese thinker in the early 20th century, like Zhang Taiyan, he put forward the thesis of so-called equality of all things. Equality, trying to, it looks like the resonate with the current idea of the post-anthropocentrism idea. So from that idea, he tried to argue that human being could be, among other things, to rethink about the idea of equality, not only between or among the human beings, but also in the different things in the universe. So try to elaborate some new logic about the world and the cosmos. So that's his idea. Obviously, his starting point is also, as you say, argue that he realized that we are living inside of the catastrophe. So that's his idea. To here, you can find some other sources, not only from the Aristotle and the early great tradition in the West, but some other ideas to rethink about the modernity and its crisis too. So here, and eventually, I would like to mention the Zhang Taiyan student, Lu Xun's idea. Here, the slogan is about the South-South Forum, that it's about the despair and the hope. Lu Xun repeatedly argued that the desperation or despair is like a elusive as hope does. So the same, but he repeated it 3 times in one prose. Each times contain different meanings. The first is a negation of hope, because hope is as same as the despair. The second is a double negation of 2 things. And eventually, after the double negation of hope and despair, he tried to create some space for thinking about the possibilities and the potentials for us. So that's in that sense, it's about the action. It's not only about the utopia. So it's to some extent is a negativity thinking to the action. So that's my comments. And also I would like to, from here, and I maybe last question is that, what's your suggestion for the reaction, for the action, I mean, from this logic, from your logic to see what kind of the work we can do. So thank you.
I wonder if I could also come in. So before Paul responds, because well, since I've already taken the floor, so maybe I'll just go on. So, well, I agree with much of what Paul, evoking the deep adaptation theory, said about the question of sustainability. One example that came to my mind when Paul talked about technophilic management is the solar radiation management by NASA. They conducted solar geoengineering projects, and 4 decades ago, they attempted to brighten the marine clouds by spraying seawater into the lower atmosphere and replicate the cooling effect of volcanoes by spraying reflective sulfate particles into the upper atmosphere. And all this was done without any knowledge of how damaging the side effects could be. So do we call this arrogance or ignorance or both? So, well, to come back to Paul's arguments, I would like to make a differentiation between those who produce theories, including decision makers and intellectuals, and those on the consumption side. On the production side, they tend to have a totalizing view of the problem and offer a total solution for all. But on the consumption side, sustainability is not their language, not what they produce themselves, but rather is imposed on them, and they simply appropriate the language of sustainability. Here on the consumption side, I am referring to the subaltern groups on the fringes of society, on the fringes of history, particularly the rural communities. There, the people are often confined to a specific locality and do not have much resources at their disposal. Hence, they have to make do with whatever is at hand, so what the Sato calls bricolage. Therefore, it is as a collective that they try to deal with the immediate problems of everyday life. They are within the parameters of what they are allowed to do and nothing to do with any theory of localism. So this is particularly relevant for us when we talk about disasters as consequences of climate change. The devastating effects of climate change are not evenly distributed, and the vulnerable groups are most adversely affected. Those affected certainly cannot sit back and wait for help. They have only themselves to rely on, and in the trials and errors, they learn from their failings and come to understand better and better the thresholds of nature within which their failings and within which they can have a form of life specific to them. And they cannot easily, if at all, turn into a model to be borrowed by different geographical settings. So what we learn from them is the experience of failures, and in coming to terms with nature's thresholds, the wisdoms that strike them with regard to ways of relating to nature and to one another. So I have visited indigenous communities in Peru, for example, the Ayamarans, and also in Mexico, the Zapatistas. They go beyond the anthropocentric and subject-object divide of science. They talk about mutual nurturing among all members of the habitat, and they consider all as persons. So even a stone is a person, that they are engaged in continuous conversation with one another. So another point I want to raise is that in the context of catastrophic times, so-called hope is not considered in the context of the human world, though hope is peculiarly a human concept. Yet in this connection, hope is considered in the context of forces of nature. That is, any representation of hope is arrogant. So I see hope in terms of the energy of life to forever push in all directions, to go on hitting new turns occasionally, hence biodiversity. A final point about Maniku's courage with regard to the choice between life and death. In ancient Chinese philosophy, Lao Tzu's classic of Tao Te Ching referred to the idea of Tian Di Bu Ren. And Ackbar quoted this 2 days ago in the session with Gayatri Spivak and rendered the first part of the sentence as nature is inhuman. So I hope to hear more from Ackbar and also Wang Hui on this. So just now, Wang Hui quoted Zhang Taiyan on the equality of all things. I think the idea is that all things are on equal footing in nature. There is nothing valuable about human life itself. So whatever value human life claims to have is only conferred by the humans. Nothing universal and general about this, and depending on particular situations and contexts. Hence, in the course of history of China, which was steeped in wars of conquering one another, people were often forced to choose between life and death. What I'm particularly interested in here is the burden of choice on individuals, for him or her alone. Here, we are told that not just how to survive is important, how to die is also equally important. And Lao Tzu said, if one comes to know in the morning, one is content to die in the evening. 朝闻道，夕可死矣. So perhaps the decision need to be made by the individual himself or herself, and no one is in a position to decide for others. And my very last point is to mention one movement I have been involved in, which is the People's Plan for the 21st Century, the PP21, which is also called the Alliance of Hope. And Muto Ichio, a key organizer, when he talked of the need to go out of the catastrophes to make another world possible, he said, we need a quantum leap, a break from what we are, what we have, and what we are resigned to accept as our fate. And I feel that this time for the forum, we say we are discussing not hope, but the politics of hope. So back to you now, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you very much. These are fabulous comments, which would force me back to rewrite the paper and then deliver 3 more, which of course you don't want to hear. Let me see if I can pick up some of these issues in sequence. I'm extremely interested, Ackbar, in your picking up this concept of fascination. The fact is that I'm giving 2 related seminars in the coming academic year. The first is on the problems of the language of civil unrest in US history and the language that's devoted to the right of civil unrest in the US. And in the second semester, I'm giving a course that's related to this conference topic on modernism and sustainability, or modernism and natural security. And so I've been reading a large number of books written in the last 225 years or so, which could generally be described as either apocalyptic, utopian, or despairing. From the writings of the first free Black Americans in the first part of the 19th century, works which are enthusiastic in their commitment to liberty and religion, seeing religion as the means to freedom and equality, all the way through to the most recent dystopic films and novels of the last 15 or 20 years, Korea and elsewhere. What has struck me as extraordinarily interesting, and Ackbar, you've helped me think about this very, very briefly, I'll say this, is that no matter what the extremity of the situation that's being presented or confronted, the intellectual class here, now we're not speaking of the people, but rather of the intellectual class, and the response has been one of fascination, of a kind of attendant, aesthetic, as well as political interest in the most severe and awful things, from extermination to slavery, impoverishment, and so on. So the fascination becomes an element that enables focused attention on the questions which are at hand, on the realities which are so horrifying. I hope to be able to write more about that as as you've just mentioned, it's very helpful. I do want to say a couple of things, though, too, because I obviously wasn't quite clear enough in my earlier remarks, and that is, I don't think that deep adaptation theory allows us to say with any certainty that we are now in the catastrophe. If, as I suspect, deep adaptation theory is fundamentally a theory attempting to develop an ethics, out of which could emerge all of these questions of how to think and how to make use of resources available to us, not in this case immediately physical, but rather intellectual and cultural resources, then deep adaptations theory, since you mentioned Polanyi, is in the sphere of the as if, the obs als, right? We cannot say without contradiction that science tells us we are in catastrophe, both because the data is not absolute on the one hand, and because it would contradict deep adaptation theory if it appealed to data science as the basis of its own position. Rather, it presumes that by seeing the possibility that is revealed by the practices of intellectuals, elites, the effects in nature, for example, the state of California is now transforming itself from a forested land, as Ackbar knows well, to an emerging combination of desert and grassland. And I have been in Beijing when the air has been unfit to breathe, of course. So we see lots and lots of evidence, which is in itself enough to motivate the demand for a new ethic. So there's no necessity to believe that the catastrophe, as it were, is here. Saying such a thing would be to extend the forms of time, past, present, and future time attached to notions of progress and so on, that are so common and so problematic. We must much rather think about the present moment, understanding the pure uncertainty of things, enabling us therefore to live the good life, achieve virtues as they're necessary and possible in order to think and discover resources that otherwise have been obscure to us, and to invent. There's more to say about that, but we live now, and we don't live with an expectation that the future is known. We don't believe even that the present is known as a form of a future. So to say that the catastrophe is already here is to say the future is here. And we can't say that. That's a conceptual problem, as well as an emotionally and politically disabling one. We have to, in fact, have the courage, to use their word, of thinking that the future is already here, but not believing the future is already here. So there's a difference here between belief and action, between the aestheticization of our self-understanding and our position on the one hand, and the falsity of scientific assurance and rhetoric on the other. The probe has to be pushed deeper in order to make sure that we're not even unintentionally echoing formations that we believe to be intolerable and discredited. So I want to make a point about that. I pick up on this question of transport. In English, of course, transport is a very complicated word. It's etymologically the same word in English as it is in many of the European languages. It is the same word as the word tradition, right? And it is also connected to the business sense of moving something from here to there. So it's the same word in English as the word in Latin and other European languages. Transport is not only to become ecstatic, for example, to be transported by emotion. It is also to carry on tradition. And you carry on tradition because in Latin, the word transport is rooted to the related to the root trahere, which means to drag or carry. So a person who is transporting is carrying and dragging things. But English also, as you know from the case of Australia's history in particular, transport is also related to the notion of exile and to the notion of criminals. So when you are in transport, you are purging something that's undesirable. Witness the original white Australians as criminals, right? But you're also ecstatic, passionate, but carrying forward tradition, but also using that tradition to revitalize itself in the moment of a new ecstasy. So we have a very complicated notion of transport, which I did in fact write about a great deal. I would say, though, also to pick up another point, that this paper really can't be called Hope's Shadow. I don't think. It needs to be called rather by something else that would suggest that hope is something that blots out the sun. It is a deeply dangerous notion. I'm trying to suggest and I don't mean this in purely a political term, but in a cultural and intellectual term as well, and references by Qin Lao recently to the lives of indigenous peoples carrying on locally makes the point. Hope is conservative. It requires if not a restoration, then a retention. Right? And it also is in the darker sense of the word transport. Hope is something which drags us back or keeps us within. Hence, again, in English, certain constant features of language, like we have to keep hope alive is a common phrase. Keep hope alive belongs to Black Lives Matter, for example, to Obama, to lots of progressive forces. But it also belongs in the United States to the most reactionary Christian, Republican, authoritarian forms of belief. Keep hope alive. So hope is a real problem, I think, for us conceptually. Once we realize that, I think now to pick up on Wei's very important point here, it obliges us, as I tried to say at the end of my remarks, to look elsewhere. What can that mean, to look elsewhere? Well, you know, you began by introducing Confucius, and then you elaborated several other important thinkers in Chinese tradition and Chinese modernity as places and figures whose work to which one might look. I agree. I ended by saying that one of the things that the rhetoric of hope, even in its most radical form, has done has been to inscribe us in modes of intellectual and ethical and political life of a kind, of a way that has kept us from looking elsewhere for what are alternatives. Now, Love's Shadow, the book, is a defense of poetry and poetics, the Greek word being poiesis, which is both the writing of poetry, of course, but all the forms of creativity, which extends from making shoes to activists inventing politics, to revolutionary parties staging grand marches, right, to the reorganizations of society. These are all acts of poiesis and creativity. However, the book also makes the argument that established forms of imagination, embodied in the poetic acts of creativity at all these different levels, creating and helping to form the real in relation to power, can become themselves obstacles. Obstacles in what sense? They press upon imagination in such a way that the imagination's primary task, not of critique, but of producing alternatives to what is repressed. This then forces us to go back one way to your comment, to the fine question, I think, of where alternatives lie, as opposed to where alternatives are proclaimed. So my polemical point here against deep adaptation theory is, of course, that it proposes its own radicalization as a having come to the root in such a way that it can then provide alternatives that are somehow not contaminated by its own history. My point is that is not true, which does not mean, however, that the work of deep adaptation theory has no value. But if it is not true, then it means that what deep adaptation theory does and the value it gives us on offer is not enough. Whatever that means, we don't quite know. Let me answer now, Wang Wei, your final question. In 1986, sorry to refer back that long, but as some of you know, I am a very old person. In 1986, I published a book at that time with Columbia University Press called what was it called? Intellectuals in Power.
Yeah.
In which I adapted various notions from post-structuralism, European Marxism, and so on, to describe the implication of intellectual life with formations of power. And I didn't mean by formations of power only the formations of state and political power, but in a kind of Foucauldian sense related to the problems of discourse and history, the inscription of intellectual life in the productive forces of power. Power in a Foucauldian sense considered as that which produces, that which makes possible, that which enables. And of course, as we know, it enables in certain ways, not others, right, for various reasons. I remember very prominently in my imagination, in my memory, I think this is true, I don't think I've made this up, in 1986, long after the paper was published, I was talking about it to a very large audience at the University of Notre Dame, which is a Catholic university of importance in the United States. The audience received the paper very well. The hand that immediately went up said, okay, fine, so you've done this devastating critique of where we are and what we do. Tell us what to do. In 2003, at the American Studies Association in Washington, D.C., I gave a paper also related to forecasting what was in the new book on Love's Shadow, which is a critique of the tendency in modern literary criticism to allegorize history. And I expected the Americanists, American studies scholars who do nothing but allegorize, to object strongly. In fact, they didn't object. What they said was, thank you for this critique. We completely agree with you. Tell us now what to do if we don't do this. I hear your final comment, Wang Wei, in that tradition. Right? You're asking, as they were, for a foreshadowing, a foretelling, a prescription, an answer, a program. Right? This is not, I submit, the intellectual's task here. Right? It's like Bloch in both of his sets of books on hope. Right? It is like him and like Sienna and Guy, and certainly the much less intellectually interesting Rita Felsky. It is like rushing past the moment of the negative, as if the moment of the negative itself were somehow by itself insufficient unless it was left behind. It is not my task to leave the negative behind. Were it my task to leave the negative behind, then what would I be doing? I would not be saying, nor would I believe, that we live as we stand before catastrophe. The entire paper today was about, I hate to use this phrase because it belongs to a warmonger, but we stand in the face of the unknowable unknowns. The task we have, drawing upon whatever resources we possibly can find, with all the judgment that we can use to make careful fine lines of distinction between invention, transport, and creativity on the one hand, and repetition, iteration, and so on the other. Right? Doing all of that, right, in order to try to allow for the production of alternatives. To use an older kind of Adorno-esque phrase in defense of the Enlightenment regarding the church, regarding religion, one of the tasks of reason is to clear the ground. Not to leave ruin and rubble, therefore allowing allegory or demanding allegory as the only response, despite Fred Jameson's claims. But you clear the ground. And then, in a sense, it's part of your task to step away. Part of your task, not all of your task. The arrogance to be worried about, which preempts the struggles of people everywhere in the complexity of their history, personal, local, national, at all the points of intersection that are involved in this, right? The intellectual must not be in a prescriptive position. Now, you can, of course, because you're extraordinarily clever and know this, say that what I am now doing is offering something that echoes various forms of other statements of people who would, in fact, have said, these are the ways to plan our lives, these are the ways to be ethical. And it would be true when you say that. It would be like Jonathan Lear saying of Menikou, that you step forward, you say, from this point on, nothing happens. It cannot happen. But yet there will be life. Now, all the people I've been talking about in the paper today believe in the priority of the human, and they believe the human's priority must be defined by ethics, by the formation of an ethos, which makes possible, in the old Aristotelian phrase, a good life, an ethical life, a life of responsibility to the capacities of the human as a species, its social interactions, and above all, its responsibilities to the planet. All of that. My point is, of course, that as brilliant and attractive as that model is, we recognize it as precisely a burden of the past. It is the ideal model for those who can think of nothing else as intellectuals standing in the face of catastrophe. But in the novel I alluded to, Purple Cloud, that is not a position which the sole survivor takes. Right? His position is to burn it all down, bring it all to an end. Who are we to say that that is the ethically inappropriate position? Who are we to say this? Perhaps the proper form of courage is to exterminate the species. There are people who would say that, right? These are lines of argument which need to be adjusted and so on as best we can in the moment. But what we do in the moment, if what we fear and anticipate actually becomes, then what we do in the moment will matter very little. Because that's Bendel's position about deep adaptation theory. If it's right, it too will be exterminated. This is hard for us to imagine, that all that we've created, Aristotle, Confucius, Shanghai, New York, Paris, all these creations, the libraries of Congress, the great universities in Beijing, these will be gone. And then, if there is a then, you see, then we need to think like that. So you can say in many forms within Chinese tradition, about which I know far too little, that stones have the same value as people. I don't believe that, by the way. But you could say in the Western tradition, in Francis of Assisi, for example, who could call fire brother. There's a famous story of Francis of Assisi wearing his simple cloak. His cloak caught fire. To save his life, his friends rushed to put the fire out. Francis of Assisi said, "No, do not harm brother fire. It has as much right to live and consume me as I have to live by its warmth." Of course, his friends saved him. Now, on the question of whether the species is or is not different from or more or less valuable than, we can't answer this question, I think, without, among other things, a serious consideration of what we call, by this terrible word, consciousness. It's related to the larger question in physics and in cosmology. Is there any other intelligence in the world? The tendency to answer that is by saying, yes, there are other forms of intelligence. I mean, now the fashionable argument is to make the claim, as we see in popular culture, that octopus is a form of intelligence different than the human. Animal studies, of course, insist upon intelligence and emotion, so that I'm not sure that animal studies people would agree with you that hope is a quality solely of the human species. That's another question to which we do not know an answer. And so therefore we should be extremely careful how we speak. Can we even know an answer to that? What would it take? Some questions can't find answers. The point of that being, of course, what's caught in the dark matter, dark energy, over the horizon problems of cosmology. So we're caught in all of these ambiguous positions. Having said that, if we look at our long histories on the shelves where books sit that we have not yet read, there are things, perhaps, there are perhaps even things that have not yet come to the form of books that we don't know. So there we are. Anyway, I'm sorry for such long answers, but your comments are all provocative as hell. So
let me very quickly take up with an example this question of hope and ethics. Like the question of the practice of hope is also a kind of ethical problem. But then here we have to see ethics as the questioning of the ethical. And maybe I can get to the point most quickly by citing a film. And the film I'm thinking about is Scorsese's film Silence, which is based on Endo's novel, Silence. And it's about Jesuits, because Paul mentioned Jesuits, I think, at one point. Jesuits, not in China, but in Japan, right? Jesuits who are trying to turn Japanese into, convert Japanese into Christians, which could also be seen as an act of colonialism. But the issue then is this: you have this very smart or devious Japanese inquisitor who does this. I mean, the Jesuits have converted some people, and so the choice that the inquisitor places before the Jesuit priests is this, right? Are you going to, they're not going to sort of kill the Jesuits, because if they kill the Jesuits, that's exactly what they want. Then it will be martyrdom, right? So they die defending their faith, and it's martyrdom. But what they then did was this ploy of not killing the Jesuits, but killing their converts, right? So the Jesuits have to face this thing of seeing the people they've converted to Christianity die one by one unless they renounce their faith. Now, here you see, I think, the ethical problem of hope, if you like, and in this case of religion, because which is the more courageous thing to do? You defend your faith, die a martyr, which in a way is easy, because that's a model that these Jesuits in fact long for, or do the other thing, and this has some relationship with the Manny Cruz story, right? Do the other thing, which is seemingly to collaborate, seemingly to renounce, right? So, but the choice here, I think what's interesting about the film is that the choice is not between faith and apostasy, right? Faith and giving up your faith. What it is saying, and that I think is a point that relates to what we're talking about, is the way in which apostasy, renunciation of faith, is in fact what makes faith possible. Because without apostasy, right, without the possibility of apostasy, faith is just a dogma, right? Faith is just so you don't have a polarization of faith and apostasy, but the way in which they come together. And this, of course, is also what, in another context, the filmmaker Pasolini calls heretical empiricism, right? So you see, if you link it up to the question of skepticism, it's not skepticism, it's heretical empiricism. Empiricism would be like being concerned with the facts, but not like in a kind of devout, faithful way, that unless you can betray it, right? Unless you can betray facts, the facts are just dogmas. So I think, and that I think to a certain extent defines the one of the ways of defining the ethical problem. And maybe I could just sort of add another point, which is about planning. And here I'd like to cite the great theorist Mike Tyson. You know, Mike Tyson was the most fearful boxer in history of boxing. And Mike Tyson said about game plans, people going into a boxing match with a game plan. He said, and this is a really great theoretical statement, he says, everyone has a game plan until he's punched in the face.
One thing I agree with that the intellectual task, what's not, it's still, I appreciate that the idea avoid, it's the critique of the arrogance of like elite's arrogance for these. I try to make the distinction between two levels, I think. It's also about the futurity or the future or the hope and so on and so forth. The future, or whether or not we can rethink about the future as so-called the suppressed reality, which means that it's really inside of unknowing. It's also about not only about the catastrophe, but also all the reality, but some elements. That's why Lu Xun said that we actually don't know what's the potentials inside of all these reality. And in order to know that, he actually mentioned that in a literary form. He argued that on the one hand, we don't know whether or not there was such a way out, for example, or whether or not we should. But to resist the despair itself can achieve something from the action. I mean, in that sense, he didn't give give some certain direction or the idea, but basically, it's for me, it's still kind of the question about how to unknown and knowing, the dialectical relations, because you want to know, because unconscious. Suppose you unconscious of something means something there. So there's always something outside of us. So in that sense, I think that there was some part of the overlaps between your arguments with what we interpret and also the South Forum cited that logic, Lu Xun's sentence for that. But on the other hand, he always tried to see something from the so-called action, means that the practice, because practice as a way, it's not only the doing something, but also knowing something, trying to knowing something. So trying to know something, maybe it's different from the, I mean, it's not mean that we eventually we know everything. So this is the older logic. It's also reminded me of the Copernicus. He wrote in the preface. Some people said that the two sentences were the translation of Confucius' idea that is to know that what we know, to know that what we don't know, that's the true knowledge. So it eventually returned to the knowledge issue, but how to know that it's what we don't, the challenge, the bottom or the limits of the knowledge, it still shows that the one. I don't know whether or not these are kind of the utopia or the realistic or something else, but these are, I think, you find the overlaps between these, the Copernicus and the Confucius, and also the what I said, that the Lu Xun tried to contest the limits of our knowing about it. When he said that because he was surprised by the whole idea of depression or the despair. That's why what he know is that everything was despair, but he said that we should know the limits of that. So that's his idea.
Paul, to have the last words. Paul, please.
Thank you, and thank you for that, and thank you for everything, and thank you to everyone else. The last word is such a terrible thing to be left with. I do want to make one point, however, just in case it's in any way unclear. I do not believe that the critique of hope and the effort to displace hope from its centrality has as its result or its corollary the emergence and establishment of despair.
Yeah, that's the emergency issue.
Right. I mean, so to be for the moment, to be deconstructive, as it were, for just a moment, the binary relation hope-despair is one of the problems, of course, for us, because you often say, well, I'm skeptical about hope, and people say, well, despair is of no use. This is a useless position, it seems to me, right? That's exactly how these two terms enable each other. So one has to stay away from it, and I think one way what we are coming essentially to a point of intersection here, because, as I said, the problem is to find that fine point where the resources we find the most promising and sophisticated, can be themselves refined and judged, because that is in fact one of the tasks of the intellectual. It's not the only way in which these questions, the only way in which the realities of living in the face of catastrophe is dealt with. I mean, it is the highest form of error to believe the intellectual is the only figure who counts and has a role in this. And I include, of course, in the intellectual, the planners in the state. And I mean, I have friends who are high members of the US government. I mean, they're Harvard graduates with advanced degrees. These are high intellectual figures. And, you all know people within the party and in the state and China and elsewhere. So the category of intellectual is indeed even extended into business and finance and so on. But then again, there are the people who are outside those elites, and they do have to deal with circumstances in their own way. At times they can be extraordinarily and must be extraordinarily inventive. We cannot say to them, however, that what remains after hope is suspended is despair. We can't do that. So insofar as we can find any way to fulfill our own purpose as intellectuals, which is to locate the resources in the traditions, in thinking, in action, in life, and bring our skills and our leisure to think, to bear on these things, because it's the people in the farms, in the rural communities, in the unemployed factories outside here, Pittsburgh, where the steel mills no longer exist because, unfortunately, they're either in the People's Republic or they're in Hungary or someplace else. They're no longer here. Those people are certainly not going to hear what we have to say. They're going to have to find their own ways, even as, the farmers in Imperial Valley in California are now having to find their own way, as they do not have water any longer as a result of these kinds of changes. How this will be done, I have no idea. It just does seem to me that we need to, as intellectuals, also police ourselves, if I can use that terrible word. And I'm with the deep adaptation people in strong criticism of institutionalized, professionalized work, which turns knowledge in its positive form into capital and possession. And that then becomes one of the obstructions, as obstructive as the denialists in a different way. That it obscures the forces of creativity, even though it adds seemingly endlessly to the positive accumulation of specialized studies, refinements, sub areas of investigation, creating a kind of extraordinary ignorance in which persons can speak with expertise about whatever is at the bottom of the deep well of their work, but can speak of nothing else. And therefore can't bring everything else to bear on the deep well of their work. So for example, in my university, I cannot, which is deeply involved in the production of antiviruses in its medical school, I cannot say to them, you should perhaps consider reading these philosophers or those literary writers. The answer to the response I would get is, they do not help me in the laboratory. Full stop. Right? Or the best version of that will be, well, if this pandemic is ever over, then I will try to read, for example, Thucydides on the plague in Athens, or Camus on the plague in Algeria, or whatever the case may be. But I have no time to admit that kind of knowledge to the practice of my everyday life. This impoverishment is very dangerous, it seems to me. But anyway, I stopped. Thank you all extremely very much for this occasion and for this opportunity to have discussion with important people, as at least here, I hope the COVID lockdown will free us, end and free us, back into visiting Hong Kong, or having people from Beijing come to Boston again, or whatever the case may be. So thank you all very, very much. It's very generous of you. Thank you.